Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session with Kaitlyn Petronglo. She's an advanced analytics consultant at Logic 2020 and would be presenting the talk Data Science That Delivers, Applying Agile Methodology in Exploratory Teams. Just a quick note, please post your questions to the Q&A box instead of the chat. And there are some active polls if you want to engage with the talk. And Kaitlyn, off to you to get started.
Thank you. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this talk. If you have a moment, please fill out the poll that just went live. We're going to be talking about Agile today, so I thought it made sense to just kind of see what the experience level is with a group. If you don't have Agile experience, totally fine. You don't need it to attend this chat, and I think either way, hopefully you're going to get something valuable out of it. Definitely curious to know if anybody has used it before and liked it, or used it and has other preferences for other methodologies. I think Agile can be really great, especially for data science, but there are use cases where it's not a fit. So I want to recognize that as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Kaitlyn Petronglo. I am an advanced analytics consultant at Logic 20, a technology consulting firm located in Seattle. I have a background in project management, data science, and machine learning. I didn't originally come from a technology background, so I have a lot of experience with other project management methodologies. So if that's kind of where you're coming from as well, feel free to ask questions about that. Really want to talk about how Agile can be effective for data science and in particular exploration, but also interested about the experiences that the group has had. All right, so just getting my slides together. All right, so getting into it, I want to start by talking about what data science often looks like in reality. It can be really challenging to get data science teams up and running to serve the business, getting their analysis to actually turn into something that can be productionized, right, and actually used by the business. Then we're going to talk about how Agile can help, right? There's a couple components of the Agile philosophy that I'm going to unpack a little bit more. Then we'll do a recap. If you have questions as I'm going through stuff, please put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end. If there is an opening and you really want to come off mute, I don't think we have a huge group, so you can feel free to do that as well. All right, so I'll start with the reality of data science projects. This is, I think, a common kind of scenario that happens when a data science team is new. And often in a lot of organizations, data science is new. It's a new technology. It's a new kind of area of business operations and IT. And so oftentimes the business isn't quite sure how to use data science and how to use machine learning, but they want to, and they know that it can help to improve business operations and help to empower decision making. So I think oftentimes it starts with what feels like a general request, a simple request from the business team. Like, for instance, how can we improve sales? So the data science team takes that question, runs with it, does data discovery. Sometimes it can be a big ask just to find the data if it's not a centralized place before EDA can even begin. Starts developing models, starts training models, retraining, feature engineering, all of those really time-consuming kind of open-ended data science tasks. And by the time the data science team connects back with the business, well, reality has changed. A lot of times the priorities have changed. Sometimes the business may react to the analysis that was done with more questions, different questions, more specific questions. And so that starts what I kind of view as a cycle of exploration. And the outcome there is that since nothing's productionized and nothing's finalized for the business, the value of data science is diminished and the business starts to wonder, do we need this team? There's frustration on both ends and the cycle just kind of churns. So how can Agile help break out of this cycle to deliver business value? That's what we are going to talk about next. I want to actually, before I move on to this, I want to see if we could close the poll down. I'm curious. I'm going to close the poll. I'm curious to see kind of what responses we got. Okay. So in terms of who's used Agile on a data science project, we're about 50-50, which is pretty good. Definitely glad to see that it's being used. That's awesome. And then we got some split responses for experience level with Agile. It looks like about a quarter of us have no experience, which is totally fine. I'm glad that this is I hope this will be a good introduction. Some of us know what it is but haven't used it. We got 37% for used it and like it, and about 10% for I've used it, but it's not my favorite. So definitely want to hear from those folks as well. Okay, so I want to start with an overview of the Agile methodology. So Agile is not a project management framework by itself. It's a set of 12 guiding principles. I'm not going to talk through each of them, but I want to call out the ones I think are most valuable to data science. So by design, Agile promotes self-organizing teams. Within an Agile team, you have your dev team, and then you have two specific roles, the Scrum Master and the Product Owner. The Product Owner represents the customer, and the Scrum Master protects the team and kind of evangelizes Agile to help the team perform better. I want to emphasize that the Scrum Master and the Product Owner are not project managers. So that's kind of a core difference between Agile and other approaches is there isn't a project manager. There isn't somebody who's kind of putting together the big project plan and saying, this is when this is due, this needs to go in parallel. The team does that together. And so in that way, the team is self-organizing. Agile welcomes changing requirements. In fact, it's kind of built by design to embrace those. And so that can be really helpful in exploratory teams when every time you do EDA or every time you develop a new model, you learn something new that might change what the requirements are for the solution. And the business is always changing as well. So the product owner, and we're going to talk about the team structure more in depth in a couple slides, but the product owner is really responsible for being that line of communication between the end user, the business, and the dev team. And so they can help surface those requirements, prioritize them, and translate them to the dev team to inform the work. Next, delivering working software in small increments. Small increments is huge in Agile. These are called, there's two different measures for these. There's sprints, which is how long you take to do the work. We're going to go through the sprint cycle next. And then there's user stories, which is kind of how you describe the work. Agile's number one tenet is that the software has to work. So every time you deliver something, it needs to work, which in data science, could mean it needs to answer a question. It needs to accomplish something that has value to your customer. And then finally, a nice segue, business value and customer needs are central to Agile. It is all about the customer. You want to make sure you're spending time developing something that your end user can actually use and wants to use. Okay, so moving on to short iteration cycles. This is a sprint workflow. I'm going to talk largely to how Agile is done in Scrum, which is a type of Agile framework, but there's other ways that you can do Agile. So just know that kind of when I'm walking through these next couple of slides, I'm talking about Scrum. That's kind of what I've used on my projects, but there are other variations and you can always seek kind of a hybrid depending on what your use case is. So when we do a sprint, it's usually 1 to 2 weeks long. I've seen it done longer, probably wouldn't recommend it. Again, you can always do an anti-pattern, which is an anti-pattern in Scrum is just something you're not supposed to do that goes against the teachings. But I would recommend trying to at least at first, if your team is new, be as strict as possible in implementing Agile. And then kind of once you learn how to do it, you kind of go from there and are able to customize. So how do we organize the work in these short sprint cycles? We don't have project plans in Agile, as I mentioned. We do have a product backlog. The product owner is in charge of the product backlog. They are the owner. They are in charge of prioritizing the backlog. So the backlog's full of user stories, which we're going to talk about in a second. Well, the product owner is the one who goes in and says, this is the order we're going to do the stories in. The Scrum Master helps manage the backlog. The dev team absolutely helps to write stories, contributes ideas, but they're not prioritizing. When we start a sprint, which is 2 weeks long, so the day before the sprint, there's a Scrum ceremony called sprint planning. That's when the team comes together, dev team included, looks at the sprint backlog and decides what can we reasonably commit to in this sprint, commit to finishing. So in the sprint backlog is a subset of user stories that you're going to accomplish in this sprint. Everything you do in Agile is for the customer. So even if your customer is another team in your organization, you are viewing the way that you prioritize and write your work through the lens of what that team needs to do operationally. What decisions do they need to be able to make? If you're operating, say you're building a system, what do they need to be able to go and do in that system in order to be able to do their jobs and to meet their business goals? And then finally, by the end of the sprint, you've completed your user stories. We're going to talk about what a user story is. These are defined by the functionality they deliver. So your user story should give something to your customer. Okay, moving on to the next slide. I mentioned that Agile teams are designed to self-organize. This is an example of an Agile team. So an Agile data science team. We have our dev team up here, a couple different roles, and then product owner and Scrum Master. I think we all kind of understand what the dev team does. So I'm going to focus more on the product owner and Scrum Master because I think they're different than traditional waterfall or other techniques. As I mentioned, the Scrum Master is not a project manager. This is probably the weirdest difference between Agile and like PMBOK, for instance. If you have a PMP, you'll know what that is. And it can be a little jarring at first. And as somebody who I came over from doing more traditional project management to Agile, it was really odd getting on calls and not having people report into me to tell me where they were, their tasks. But Agile works differently. The Scrum Master is more of somebody who goes behind the scenes, makes sure that the team has what they need to succeed, removes impediments, leads Scrum ceremonies, that's really huge, and coaches the team to be more agile, to work more effectively, to be more engaged. The product owner owns the product backlog. They are responsible for writing stories often and hopefully with the team's input and prioritizing the work. They interface directly with stakeholders to gather requirements, and they represent the customer. So typically they're going to have a lot of calls and communication with the customer in different parts of the business, and they're going to bring those back to the dev team. That ensures that you don't have a situation where the dev team is working on something that isn't going to bring value to the customer. All right, so finally, I'm going to talk about user stories. These, I think, are the most important part of Agile from my perspective. I think for data science, they can be a real game changer. So to manage an Agile project, you're typically using a software like Jira or Azure DevOps. You're not working in like a typical, you wouldn't do this in a spreadsheet, for instance, or a Microsoft project. So a user story, this is an example of how it'd be written, but this is actually going to be in a software program and have that interactivity. So I just want to point that out. So user story is written to clearly articulate what functionality is being developed, why, and for who. The product backlog is composed of user stories. Just quickly kind of looking at the description, you always want to say who you're developing for. Sometimes you're developing for your team. If you're a data scientist and you need a different functionality in order to put a model into production, then you can write the user story from that perspective. If you are delivering something that's more for the customer wants to be able to go into your model and visualize predictions on a map, for instance, maybe you write it from that perspective. But you have to be clear about what the activity is that the functionality will enable and what the business value is. So why do they need to do this? Will it save money? Will it make their decision-making process faster? What's the business value? And then another very important part, and again, the dev team really needs to be involved in this, is the acceptance criteria. So how will you know that this functionality has been delivered? So you write a few bullets, usually 3 to 5, no more than that, on acceptance criteria that the dev team can use to test the functionality and the product owner can use to validate the functionality. So this is a when I X, it should result in, right? So it's testable, and that's really important. Doesn't mean it has to be testable from like a development standpoint always, but it needs to be able to be validated. And then finally, and I think this is super helpful for exploratory teams, story points. A really good way to time box your activities so exploration doesn't take weeks and weeks is to assign a story point to a story. And you have to do this for every single story in the backlog. So it should never be a case that a story goes into sprint and doesn't have story points attached. These values often will use the Fibonacci sequence, but if you Google it, you can find a lot of different kind of numeric scales that are used for story points, but they need to represent what effort means to your team. So if you were to compare 2 Scrum teams, they might use, for instance, the value of 5 story points very differently. That's okay. It just has to be consistent within your team. It establishes a mutual understanding across the team, right, of how much effort does it take to get this story done. All right, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions before I move on to my recap. Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I am going to continue on ahead. I know we don't have too much time left. All right, so recap, how can Agile help data science teams? So I think short sprint iterations is huge, right? So we're making sure that we don't start working on things that aren't needed anymore. Requirements can change quickly. So shorter iterations ensure that we're not doing something that doesn't need to be done. The product owner is a core role in a Scrum team, and they represent the customer. They engage daily with the dev team to ensure that what is being built is what the customer needs and wants and what aligns to business goals. The product backlog is like a project plan 2.0, and it establishes priority and articulates the scope via user stories. Agile delivers working software. In data science, it can be a little hard at first to understand what does that mean. We're not necessarily developing software. So it could be something as simple, right, as a notebook that documents EDA on a particular data set. It just depends on how you write your user story, but there has to be an outcome, and it has to clearly articulate value. And then finally, the Scrum Master is not a project manager. They identify ways for the team to work more effectively by leveraging the Agile philosophy. All right, well, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that everybody found this to be helpful and hopefully learned something new. Again, my name is Kaitlyn Petronglo. I'm a consultant at Logic 2020, which we are located in Seattle. We actually have a booth at the expo today, so if you have a moment to stop by, we'd love to talk with you. Thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you for walking us through that. We can transition now to Q&A. I see one pop up, so I'll read it out. And how do you suggest we estimate effort for unknowns like EDA?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so when you say effort, I'm going to guess that you mean that you're talking about the story points that I had referenced. It really has to do with writing your user story. Sometimes EDA, in waterfall, EDA would be like one line item on your project plan, right? Have a start and an end date. But if you're writing a user story, you're challenged to split up that task into something that can fit in a 2-week sprint, right? Or a 1-week sprint. So that's one way. And also you can slice it to be an incremental delivery of business value. So you want to think about, well, what do we want to know from this EDA? What would our customer do with our findings, right? So you want to split it into something that has a beginning and end and that is valuable to the customer. I would say if you're struggling with like what that would look like, take something you've actually done or doing on your team and then really try to write a user story for it. See what you can come up with. See what you get when you try to break it into business value, who the customer is, and what they want to do with the work that you're doing. I'll go back to the user story in case that's a helpful reference.
I think that's a good one. There's another one in the chat. Is there any difference in how we would use Agile for software development versus a data science project?
Yeah, that's a good question. Definitely, yes. I mean, I think the core difference is that software deployment, right, is a little bit more straightforward because the variable is largely code versus the variable being code and data. And so I think that there are nuances there that you have to navigate. I have not myself done Agile for traditional software development, so I think I would have to think more about what that would look like. But I don't think that the philosophy of Agile would need to be changed all that much. I think you just might have to keep your mind a little bit more open to some of those anti-patterns or flexibilities, just because data science is so complex, right? And it is so rooted in exploration.
Thank you. I'll read one more from the Q&A. What have you seen work across data science and engineering teams when they're both using an agile method? How do they do like handoff projects or interact? The person asking the question has said that they've often found that the 2-week sprint cycle and the functional teams makes it very difficult to like easily hand off projects and move while like changing priorities or requirements.
Yeah, so I mean, if you have interdependencies between the work that your team is doing, if you're a data science team and the engineering team, I think writing your stories so that they are linked on your sprint board is helpful in surfacing what the dependencies are. If there is another team that your work is linked with, it is not a bad idea to do a quarterly planning process where you come together and you write your stories and you write your features. I didn't talk much about features. The features are kind of like the overarching level up from stories that kind of pull stories together that are related. It makes sense to write those with that other team and consult with them. Because if you're having issues handing off or it's too complex, to me that says that maybe there just isn't enough communication and that if you are using Agile, you really want to be using your board as a transparent way to document the dependencies, track the work and priorities with the teams that you're interdependent on.
Yep. We'll take one last question now as we wrap up. How have you helped your customers understand your agile methodology to gain buy-in and support?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of times customers are other teams who might not be using Agile, and getting them out of that kind of old way of operating is a change management process for sure. I think it depends. I'm thinking about my team. We came in using Agile and we're kind of serving a team that is not using it. We're able to show them by demonstrating quick value. So if you're iterating quickly, Agile lets you iterate quickly and deliver value. If you can demonstrate that to another team, I think that's the quickest sell.
Awesome. Thank you so much for walking us through this, Kaitlyn. It was a great presentation. Folks attending, please feel free to reach out to Kaitlyn via Excel events or even email her. I just put her email in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much for attending.